Because of its relative durability, pottery comprises a large part of the archaeological record of ancient Greece, and since there is so much of it, it has exerted a disproportionately large influence on our understanding of Greek society. Few examples of ancient Greek painting have survived except for what is found on the earthenware in everyday use, requiring that the development of ancient Greek art be traced through the vestiges of ancient Greek pottery. Nevertheless, the shards of pots discarded or buried in the first millennium BC are still the best guide we have to the customary life and mind of the ancient Greeks. The most familiar aspect of Greek pottery is painted vessels of fine quality in a multitude of shapes, all referred to for convenience as ancient Greek vase painting. These were not the everyday pottery used by most people, but were sufficiently cheap to be accessible to a wide range of the population. Fine Greek pottery goes back to the Minoan pottery and Mycenaean pottery of the Bronze Age, some later examples of which show the ambitious figurative painting that was to become highly developed and typical, after many centuries dominated by styles of geometric decoration, becoming increasingly complex. Figurative elements returned in force in the 8th century. For the late 7th century to about 300 BC, evolving styles of figure-led painting were at the peak of production and quality, and were widely exported. Greek terracotta figurines were another important type of pottery, initially mostly religious, but increasingly representing purely decorative subjects. Architectural terracotta elements such as antefixes decorated major buildings, and were brightly painted. There were also many types of unpainted pottery for everyday and kitchen use. Uses and types. Not all ancient Greek vases were purely utilitarian. Large geometric amphorae were used as grave markers. Craters in Apulia served as tomb offerings, and Panathenaic amphorae seem to have been looked on partly as objets d'art, as were later terracotta figurines. Earlier figurines were usually votive offerings at temples. Most other surviving pottery, however, had a practical purpose which determined its shape. The names we use for Greek vase shapes are often a matter of convention rather than historical fact. A few do illustrate their own use or are labeled with their original names. Others are the result of early archaeologists' attempt to reconcile the physical object with a known name from Greek literature, not always successfully. To understand the relationship between form and function, Greek pottery may be divided in four broad categories, given here with common types: storage and transport vessels, including the amphora, pithospe like hydria, pyxis; mixing vessels, mainly for symposia or male drinking parties, including the crater and dinos; jugs and cups, several types of kylix, also just called cups, canthros, phyle, skyphos, oinoko and lautriferos; vases for oils, perfumes and cosmetics, including the large lekathos and the small erybolos and alabastron. Some vase shapes were especially associated with rituals, others with athletics and the gymnasium. Within each category the forms are roughly the same in scale and whether open or closed. Where there is uncertainty we can make good proximate guesses of what use a piece would have served. Some have a purely ritual function. For example, white ground lekathoi contained the oil used as funerary offerings and appear to have been made solely with that object in mind. Many examples have a concealed second cup inside them to give the impression of being full of oil. As such, they would have served no other useful gain. There was an international market for Greek pottery since the 8th century BC, which Athens and Corinth appearance dominated down to the end of the 4th century BC. An idea of the extent of this trait can be gleaned from plotting the find maps of these vases outside of Greece, though this could not account for gifts or immigration. Only the existence of a second-hand market could account for the number of Panatheniaics found in Etruscan tombs. South Italian wares came to dominate the export trade in the Western Mediterranean as Athens declined in political importance during the Hellenistic period. Development of vase painting. Earlier Greek styles of pottery, called Aegean rather than Ancient Greek, include Minoan pottery, which was very sophisticated by its final stages, Cycladic pottery, Minoanware, and then Mycenaean pottery, followed by the cultural disruption of the Greek Dark Age. Is the culture-recovered sub-Mycenaean pottery finally blended into the proto-geometric style, which begins Ancient Greek pottery proper. Proto-geometric styles. Vases of proto-geometrical period represent the return of craft production after the collapse of the Mycenaean palace culture and the ensuing Greek Dark Ages. It is one of the few modes of artistic expression besides jewelry in this period, since the sculpture, monumental architecture and mural painting of this era are unknown to us. Yet by 1050 BC life in the Greek peninsula seems to have become sufficiently settled to allow marked improvement in the production of earthenware. The style is confined to the rendering of circles, triangles, wavy lines and arcs, but placed with evident consideration and notable dexterity, probably aided by compasses and multiple brush. Attic production was the first to resume and influence the rest of Greece, especially Boeotia, Corinth, the Cyclades and the Ionian colonies in the East Aegean. The site of Lefkandi is one of our most important sources of ceramics from this period, where a cache of grave goods has been found giving evidence of a distinctive Euboean proto-geometric style which lasted into the early 8th century. Geometric style. Geometric art flourished in the 9th and 8th centuries B.C. It was characterized by new motifs, breaking with the representation of the Minoan and Mycenaean periods, meanders, triangles and other geometrical decoration as distinct from the predominantly circular figures of the previous style. However, our chronology for this new art form comes from exported wares found in datable contexts overseas. With the early geometrical style one finds only abstract motifs in what is called the black dipylon style, which is characterized by an extensive use of black varnish, with the middle geometrical, figurative decoration makes its appearance. They are initially identical bands of animals such as horses, stags, goats, geese, etc., which alternate with the geometrical bands. In parallel, the decoration becomes complicated and becomes increasingly ornate. The painter feels reluctant to leave empty spaces and fills them with meanders, or swastikas. This phase is named horror vacui and will not cease until the end of geometrical period. In the middle of the century there begin to appear human figures, the best known representations of which are those of the vases found in Dipylon, one of the cemeteries of Athens. The fragments of these large funerary vases show mainly processions of chariots or warriors, or of the funerary scenes. Pyro Omicron Theta Epsilon Sigma Iota Sigma Prothesis Kappa Phi Omicron Rho Alpha Ekphora. The bodies are represented in a geometrical way except for the calves, which are rather protuberant. In the case of soldiers, a shield in form of a diabolo, called dipylon shield because of its characteristic drawing, covers the central part of the body, the legs and the necks of the horses. The wheels of the chariots are represented one beside the other without perspective. The hand of this painter, so called in the absence of signature, is the dipylon master, could be identified on several pieces, in particular monumental amphorae, At the end of the period there appear representations of mythology, probably at the moment when Homer codifies the traditions of Trojan cycle in the Iliad and the Odyssey. Here, however, the interpretation constitutes a risk for the modern observer. A confrontation between two warriors can be a Homeric duel, a simple combat. A failed boat can represent the shipwreck of Odysseus or any hapless sailor. Lastly, are the local schools that appear in Greece. Production of vases was largely the prerogative of Athens. It is well attested that, as in the proto-geometrical period, in Corinth, Boeotia, Argos, Crete and Cyclades, the painters and potters were satisfied to follow the Attic style. From about the 8th century BC on, they created their own styles, Argos specializing in the figurative scenes, Crete remaining attached to a more strict abstraction. Orientalizing style. The Orientalizing style was the product of cultural ferment in the Aegean and Eastern Mediterranean of the 8th and 7th centuries BC, fostered by trade links with the city-states of Asia Minor. The artifacts of the East influenced a highly stylized yet recognizable representational art. Ivories, pottery and metalwork from the Neo-Hittite principalities of northern Syria and Phoenicia found the way to Greece, as did goods from Anatolia and Urartu and Phrygia, yet there was little contact with the cultural centers of Egypt or Assyria. The new idiom developed initially in Corinth and later in Athens between 725 BC and 625 BC. It was characterized by an expanded vocabulary of motifs, sphinx, griffin, lions, etc., as well as a repertory of non-mythological animals arranged in friezes across the belly of the vase. In these friezes, painters also began to apply lotuses or palmettes. Depictions of humans were relatively rare. Those that have been found are figures in silhouette with some incised detail, perhaps the origin of the incised silhouette figures of the Black Figure period. There is sufficient detail on these figures to allow scholars to discern a number of different artists' hands. Geometrical features remained in the style called Proto-Corinthian that embraced these orientalizing experiments, yet which coexisted with a conservative subgeometric style. The ceramics of Corinth were exported all over Greece, and a technique arrived in Athens, prompting the development of a less markedly Eastern idiom there. During this time, described as Proto-Attic, the orientalizing motifs appear, but the features remain not very realistic. The painters show a preference for the typical scenes of the geometrical period, like processions of chariots. However, they adopt the principle of line drawing to replace the silhouette. In the middle of 7th century BC, there appears the black and white style, black figures on a white zone, accompanied by polychromy to render the color of the flesh or clothing. Clay used in Athens was much more orange than that of Corinth, and so did not lend itself as easily to the representation of flesh. Attic orientalizing painters include the Analatos painter, the Mesogeia painter and the Polyphemos painter. Crete, and especially the islands of the Cyclades, are characterized by their attraction to the vases known as plastic, i.e., those whose paunch collar is molded in the shape of head of an animal or a man. At Aegina, the most popular form of the plastic vase is the head of the griffin. The Melanesian amphoras, manufactured at Paros, exhibit little knowledge of Corinthian developments. They present a marked taste for the epic composition and a horror vacui, which is expressed in an abundance of swastikas and meanders. Finally, one can identify the last major style of the period, that of wild goat style, allotted traditionally to Rhodes because of an important discovery within the necropolis of Camiros. In fact, it is widespread over all of Asia Minor, with centers of production at Miletos and Chios. Two forms prevail: inocos, which copied bronze models, and dishes, with or without feet. The decoration is organized in superimposed registers in which stylized animals, in particular of feral goats, pursue each other in friezes. Many decorative motifs fill the empty spaces. Black figure is the most commonly imagined when one thinks about Greek pottery. It was a popular style in ancient Greece for many years. The black figure period coincides approximately with the era designated by Winckelmann as the Middle to Late Archaic, from c. 620 to 480 BC. The technique of incising silhouetted figures with enlivening detail, which we now call the black figure method, was, as we saw, a Corinthian invention of the 7th century and spread from there to other city-states and regions including Sparta, Boeotia, Euboea, the East Greek islands and Athens. The Corinthian fabric, extensively studied by Humphrey Payne and Darrell Amyx, can be traced through the parallel treatment of animal and human figures. The animal motifs have greater prominence on the vase and show the greatest experimentation in the early phase of Corinthian black figure. As Corinthian artists gained in confidence in the rendering of the human figure, the animal frieze declined in size relative to the human scene. During the middle to late phase, by the mid-6th century BC, the quality of Corinthian ware had fallen away significantly, to the extent that some Corinthian potters would disguise the pots with a red slip, in imitation of superior Athenian ware. At Athens, researchers have found the earliest known examples of vase painters signing the work, the first being Adinos by Zophilos. This perhaps indicative of their increasing ambition as artists in producing the monumental work demanded as grave markers, as for example with Clytias's François vase. Many scholars consider the finest work in the style to belong Exarchus and the Amisus painter, who are noted for the feeling for composition and narrative. Circa 520 BC, the red figure technique was developed and was gradually introduced in the form of the bilingual vase by the Andokidis painter, Oltos and Psix. Red figure quickly eclipsed black figure, yet in the unique form of the Panathenaic amphora. Black figure continued to be utilized well into the 4th century BC. Red figure. The innovation of the red figure technique was an Athenian invention of the late 6th century. It was quite the opposite of black figure, which had a red background. The ability to render detail by direct painting rather than incision offered new expressive possibilities to artists such as three-quarter profiles, greater anatomical detail, and the representation of perspective. The first generation of red figure painters worked in both red and black figure, as well as other methods including sixes technique and white ground. The latter was developed at the same time as red figure. However, within 20 years, experimentation had given way to specialization, as seen in the vases of the pioneer group, whose figural work was exclusively in red figure, though they retained the use of black figure for some early floral ornamentation. The shared values and goals of the pioneers such as Euphronios and Euthymides signal that they were something approaching a self-conscious movement, though they left behind no testament other than their own work. John Boardman said of the research on the work that the reconstruction of the careers, common purpose, even rivalries, can be taken as an archaeological triumph. The next generation of late archaic vase painters brought an increasing naturalism to the style as seen in the gradual change of the profile eye. This phase also sees the specialization of painters into pot and cup painters, with the Berlin and Kleophrades painters notable in the former category and Duris and Onzimos in the latter. By the early to high classical era of red figure painting, a number of distinct schools had evolved. the manners associated with the workshop of Meissen and exemplified by the pan painter hold to the archaic features of stiff drapery and awkward poses and combine that with exaggerated gestures. By contrast, the school of the Berlin painter in the form of the Achilles painter and his peers favored a naturalistic pose, usually of a single figure against a solid black background or of restrained white ground. Lekythoi, Polygnotos and the Kleophan painter can be included in the school of the Niobid painter, as the work indicates something of the influence of the Parthenon sculptures both in theme and in feeling for composition. Toward the end of the century, the rich style of Attic sculpture as seen in the night balustrade is reflected in contemporary vase painting with an ever greater attention to incidental detail, such as hair and jewelry. The Midias painter is usually most closely identified with this style. Vase production in Athens stopped around 330–320 BC, possibly due to Alexander's control of the city, and had been in slow decline over the 4th century along with the political fortunes of Athens itself. However, vase production continued in the 4th and 3rd centuries in the Greek colonies of southern Italy, where 5 regional styles may be distinguished. These are the Appian, Lucanian, Sicilian, Campanian and Pestan. Red figure work flourished there with the distinctive addition of polychromatic painting, and in the case of the Black Sea colony of Panticapaeum, the gilded work of the Kirch style. Several noteworthy artists' work comes down to us, including the Darius painter and the Underworld painter, both active in the late 4th century, whose crowded polychromatic scenes often essay a complexity of emotion not attempted by earlier painters. The work represents a late Mannerist phase to the achievement of Greek vase painting. White ground technique. The white ground technique was developed at the end of the 6th century BC. Unlike the better-known black figure and red figure techniques, its coloration was not achieved through the application and firing of slips but through the use of paints and gilding on a surface of white clay. It allowed for a higher level of polychromy than the other techniques, although the vases end up less visually striking. The technique gained great importance during the 5th and 4th centuries, especially in the form of small lekythoi that became typical grave offerings. Important representatives include its inventor, the Achilles painter, as well as Psix, the Pistixnus painter, and the Thanatos painter. Relief and plastic vases. Relief and plastic vases became particularly popular in the 4th century BC, and continued being manufactured in the Hellenistic period. They were inspired by the so-called rich style, developed mainly in Attica after 420 BC. The main features were the multi-figured compositions with use of added colors and an emphasis on female mythological figures. Theater and performing constituted yet one more source of inspiration. Delphi Archaeological Museum has some particularly good examples of this style, including a vase with Aphrodite and Eros. The base is round, cylindrical, and its handle vertical, with bands covered with black color. The female figure is depicted seated, wearing an himation. Next to her stands a male figure, naked and winged. Both figures wear wreaths made of leaves, and the hair preserved traces of golden paint. The features of the faces are stylized. The vase has a white ground and maintains in several parts the traces of bluish, greenish and reddish paint. It dates to the 4th century BC. In the same room is kept of small lekythos with a plastic decoration, depicting a winged dancer. The figure wears a Persian head cover and an Oriental dress, indicating that already in that period Oriental dancers, possibly slaves, had become quite fashionable. The figure is also covered with a white color. The total height of the vase is 18 centimeters and it dates to the 4th century BC. Hellenistic period. The Hellenistic period is one of cultural decline in the traditional centers of production of fine pottery vessels, but an increase in the production of decorative figurines. Fine painted pottery was apparently replaced by metalwork for many of its uses. Red figure painting had died out in Athens by the end of the 4th century BC to be replaced by what is known as westslope ware, so named after the finds on the west slope of the Athenian Acropolis. This consisted of painting in a tan-colored slip and white paint on a fired black slip background with some incised detailing. Representations of people diminished, replaced with simpler motifs such as wreaths, dolphins, rosettes, etc. Variations of this style spread throughout the Greek world, with notable centers in Crete and Apulia, where figural scenes continued to be in demand. The centuria ware of Sicily had fully colored tempera painting, including groups of figures applied after firing, making it too fragile for use. It perhaps continued into the 2nd century BC, making it possibly the last vase painting with significant figures. Bricks and tiles were used for architectural and other purposes. Production of Greek terracotta figurines became increasingly important, with decorative painted tanagra figurines among the most sophisticated. Several Greek styles continued into the Roman period, and Greek influence partly transmitted via the ancient Etruscans on ancient Roman pottery was considerable, especially in figurines.